Ladies and gentlemen, honorable guests, first of all, please let me welcome Mr. Péter Boros, former Prime Minister of Hungary between 1993 and 1994. And also a special welcome to the former participants of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. Allow me to begin my presentation with another quote from the literary celebrity of this symposium, Albert Camus. In October 1957, on the first anniversary of the Hungarian Revolution, Camus said the following in an interview: East Berlin, Poznan, Budapest. A gigantic myth collapsed. A certain truth which had long been disguised burst upon the world. And if the present is still spattered with blood and the future still dark, at least we know that the era of ideologies is over. And the force of resistance, together with the value of freedom, gives us new reasons for living. It is still debatable whether the words of the Nobel Prize-winning author who had become disillusioned with communism had truly come true, whether the era of ideologies really was over after the traumatic experience of 1956. Nevertheless, to this day, Camus' argument, as historians at least, offers an interesting point of reference for two reasons. First, Camus' assessment of the international situation was correct, inasmuch as he, as a contemporary, pointed out that the events of East Berlin, Poznan, and Budapest were stages of the same historical process, which eventually culminated in Budapest in October 1956. If we can speak about collective remembrance of the very different nations of Central and Eastern Europe, then 56 certainly became one of the most relevant moments of the 20th century of collective memory. The common historical experience of desire for freedom of societies forced into the Soviet sphere of interest and under the oppressive rule of communist dictatorships. Besides, Camus' final words seem to be equally important. It declares that the force of resistance, together with the value of freedom, gives us new reasons for living. In other words, the resistance and struggles of Eastern Europe became a source of moral renewal to disentensioned Western as well. Indeed, I would argue that the Hungarian Revolution of '56, and especially the brutal reprisals that followed it, fundamentally changed the thinking of entire generations. Camus' public statement became a kind of canon for his contemporaries, and '56 did turn into a symbol of anti-Soviet, anti-communist resistance, a symbol of the desire for freedom overwriting realpolitik, and a symbol of a political and moral dilemmas of the West, we might add. In other words, 1956 was not only a common historical experience, but a common universal cultural code, not only in the satellite states of the Soviet bloc, but on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Moreover, this common cultural code prevailed until the fall of the communist dictatorships. Nevertheless, the further we advance from the regime change of 89 and 90s, and from the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the more we might feel like the common symbolic and referential aspect of 1956 is beginning to fade. While the regime lasted, debates on the interpretations of 56 were morely confidential, partial, and confined to narrow circles of the immigration groups. However, once these debates received widespread publicity, a veritable contest had begun for the adequate interpretation of the events, reciting a multitude of discourses that certainly placed 56 in a myriad of new lights. And yet, a quarter of a century has passed since the political system changed, so the 60th anniversary compels us to assess the recent past in two important ways. On one hand, we might ask what scholars know of 56 today in the wake of the archival revolution that basically provided more or less unlimited access to the documents of the era. Has our image of 56 become clearer in the course of public debates after 1989? Have we found new consensual points in our evaluation of 56? Moreover, what are the open questions or currently debated issues in historical discourses of the revolution? On the other hand, how do we relate to remembrance of 56? This is especially relevant today on the cusp of a generation shift. We are very fortunate in having many of the contemporary witnesses of 56 still with us today, freedom fighters as well as the former victims of the post-revolutionary reprisals. At the same time, a new generation has emerged who not only had no experienced 56, including us, but were actually born after the political system change of 1989. This generation no longer has any personal experience of the dictatorship, of the regime change, or of the symbolic role of 56 in the process of the political system change. To use the famous phrase of the renowned scholar of cultural history, Jan Assmann, 1956 is gradually turning from a hot memory into a cold memory until the collective experience of a generation will ultimately become history. This, of course, will also affect the approaches, emphases, and perspectives of historical discourses, as well as the general culture of remembrance. Therefore, in designating the themes and key issues of this symposium, we kept these two perspectives in mind. Accordingly, please allow me to briefly reflect on both. The first key issue to be discussed here is the examination of the antecedents and reasons that paved the way to the revolution, to the Hungarian Revolution. Why did the most powerful and most influential outbreak of open armed resistance against the Soviet Union occur in October 1956 and in Budapest in particular? The answer is far from simple, as the nations of East and Central Europe had also suffered the same sort of all-pervasive state violence under their respective communist regimes. In addition, by the beginning of the 1950s, the Stalinist system began to show signs of similar pending crises in the bloc's countries. So in accordance with the directives of Moscow leadership, the political leaders of the satellite states began to issue minor corrective measures to maintain and consolidate their power. Nevertheless, such measures were typically executed by the same old party leadership that established the Soviet-type system in the first place, though we should note that Hungary, where the Soviets switched Mátyás Rákosi for Imre Nagy, was one of the exceptions to this particular rule. Now, what were the characteristics of the Stalinist system, and how did processes of de-Stalinization go in other satellite states? In this regard, I'm certain that the international comparison of general characteristics and local particularities of the communist regimes, the analysis of power struggles within Moscow and among local party leaders of the satellite states would contribute a wealth of new data to the comprehensive understanding and interpretations of historical events of the 1950s in the region, in which we hope our symposium will serve as a source of information as well as an interpretation, inspiration for future research. Beyond the description of the shifts and changes in the distinct center of power, research has recently been paying more attention to certain developments in 20th century Hungarian history that distinguish Hungary from other satellite states of the region. Among these features, I would like to highlight three in particular. One factor was that beyond the common regional experience of the violation of basic human rights and fundamental freedoms, and the use of mass terror against the citizens after 1945, it seems that having just lost World War II, it was Hungarian society whose national feelings, national consciousness and value system had been most profoundly violated by the newly established communist regime. Consequently, for communist leadership, one of the most crucial conclusions of '56 was that the long-term consolidation of Hungarian society could never be accomplished without at least the superficial and simulated utilization of the markers of the national identity. After the repression of the revolution, General Secretary János Kádár stated in a closed party platform that, quotation comes, "After 1956, I learned to respect not just the color red, but the tricolor of red, white, and green." Indeed, it's important to note that remedying the violations of national value system was a major demand during the revolution of 1956, one that was also clearly expressed on a symbolic level. One need only think of the holes ripped in Hungarian flags to remove the offending Soviet coat of arms, or the rapid spread of the Kossuth coat of arms in reference to the traditions of the Hungarian Revolution of 1848. Another unique characteristic of the Hungarian prehistory of the revolution is that, unlike other satellite states of East and Central Europe, after 1945, Hungary had a glimpse of hope for establishment of a parliamentary democracy, no matter how brief and delicate. In 1945, Hungary actually held free elections, with some limits, where the Communist Party lost, while the right-wing Independent Smallholders Party gained parliamentary majority. Of course, in retrospect, we know that the idea of democratic transformation was not realistic in the face of the Soviet occupation or the dynamic conquest of the Hungarian Communist Party with the aid of Moscow. However, the elaborated intentions of the period of the so-called threatened democracy, the brief, mixed, and fragile experience of a potential democratic change might have remained an important crutch to Hungarian society well into the 1950s. The third factor that might be worth considering in the fact that in the 20th century history of Europe, the greatest number of political system changes occurred in Hungary, where revolutions, counter-revolutions, and violent external interventions followed each other in rapid successions. In the context of ever-shifting international power relations, these processes led, on one hand, to the rise and fall of newer and newer elites, and on the other hand, contributed to the constant traumatization of Hungarian society, due to the fact that leadership simply could not find solution to profound social and political problems. In this respect, 1945 marked yet another radical structural change in Hungarian society, followed by a decade of intensive, violent social transformation that had a predominantly negative impact on every social class and nearly every family in Hungary. Basically, the Hungarian Stalinist dictatorship of Mátyás Rákosi entered into a confrontation with Hungarian society as a whole. Not only did it eliminate the old political, economic, and cultural elite throughout violent means, but after 1945, even the new elites suffered major losses, whether they originally sympathized with the idea of radical changes or managed to rise into power for a while. In this atmosphere of constant existential crisis and vulnerability, society actually feared the return of Mátyás Rákosi after the fall of Imre Nagy in 1955. In light of all these factors, what did eventually lead to the revolution of 1956? This is one of the basic issues of research that has long been in the focus of parallel historiographic traditions. For instance, one approach that used to dominate historical discussions considered Stalin's death as the beginning of the historical period that led to the events of 56. According to this narrative, Stalin's death inevitably led to the rise of Imre Nagy as prime minister, which led to the subsequent power struggles, the impact of the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on Hungarian leadership, the Petőfi Circle formed by pro-reform intellectuals, and finally the events of October 23rd. This well-known historical interpretation thus mainly traced back the antecedents of the revolution to the internal struggles of the Communist Party, the disillusionment of many party members, and their failed attempts at realizing any reform. In other words, the split of the party elite served as a catalyst for the events of 1956. In contrast to approaches that attribute the outbreak of the revolution mainly to the actions of the elites, approaches that focus on social actions have recently received greater attention. These approaches generally examine the historical mentalities of different social groups, which is especially important in the case of Hungary. Not only was every social group or even almost every family negatively affected by the violent social transformations of the era, but the surveys of the social history of the revolution indicates that nearly every social group participated in the events of October to some extent. In fact, one unique and defining factor of the revolution of 56 in Hungary was its widespread social support. We need only think of the key role of university students in devising the demands of the revolution, or of the workers' councils established by skilled workers, the various organizations of the intelligentsia, the armed forces of mostly unskilled workers, or the role of the peasantry in establishing democratic self-governing bodies in rural history. To provide a unique example for the latter, in a village of 750 inhabitants somewhere in Nógrád County, 10% became members of the local national committee established during the revolution, which means that practically every family was represented within the new committee. We should also know that the social diversity of 1956, which was one of the defining characteristics of the Hungarian Revolution, was not a general feature of modern revolutions at all. Another major specificity of the Hungarian Revolution is that it was not governed by the single political center. Unfortunately, the analysis of the relationship between the freedom fighters and the reform communist prime minister Imre Nagy, who waged his own war on hardline Stalinist party leaders, would greatly exceed the limits of this presentation. Therefore, I shall concentrate on the spontaneously emerging yet capable leaders of the various local groups of armed resistance, as well as those figures who were committed to establishing and operating the local institutions of democracy with the support of their own communities. Perhaps this is the most important unique characteristics of the Hungarian October. The emergence of autonomous and diverse social organizations during the days of the revolution, mostly represented by the workers' councils in urban and industrial areas and the national committees in rural areas. The significance of the latter can only be understood in light of the fact that while Budapest engaged in armed struggle against the Soviet troops, in rural areas, the Soviet-type council system was abolished within a few days to give way for true self-government. The consequences of this process can even be traced in the reprisals following the revolution, because beyond the freedom fighters and prominent members of the political opposition, the autonomously self-organizing local elites constitute the third largest target groups of the reprisals. In other words, after 1956, the newly established dictatorship targeted prominent local figures who were believed to be capable of becoming the leaders of any kind of new democratic movement. Thus, we arrived at the second major theme of this symposium, which is the issue of the reprisals following the Hungarian Revolution, in terms of their national and international consequences as well. What was the immediate effect of the revolution on neighboring countries? What movements did it inspire? What was the reaction of local authorities? How did the events of 1956 influence Soviet policies and the process of de-Stalinization? Did it accelerate the process or temporarily freeze it, then reverse it? How did the experiences of 1956 affect the way Soviet leadership handled the crisis of 1968 or the crisis of 1980 and 1981? And how did these developments affect the West? Here, I only wish to highlight some aspects of the reprisals following the revolution of 1956 and how these affected Hungarian society. Because on one hand, certain aspects of the subsequent reckoning and political revenge are also relevant to the international context. On the other hand, it seems that in the internationally scholarly discourse, the issue of reprisals are hardly ever mentioned. There is frequent and diverse discussion of the historical events of 1956, their grand international correlations, and their long-term consequences. However, the reprisals that followed, despite their brutal methods and cruelty, are often portrayed in historical overview or textbooks as a mere tragic episode. The trials and martyrdom of Prime Minister Imre Nagy and associates tends to be an exception to this rule. However, we cannot ignore the fact that onset of the Kádár regime, state violence was the most widespread social experience in Hungary. Not to mention that, as Camus pointed out, it was exactly the brutal repression of the revolution that became the final push towards the disillusionment of the intelligentsia and a catalyst for the gradual international decomposition of communist parties worldwide. This brings us to the question of how political leadership managed to establish the institutional framework of and ensure the personal conditions for the reprisals. When we examine the personnel of the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Justice, and the Hungarian military, what can we see about the socialization before 1956 and their careers in the late Kádár era? Was there a continuity between political leadership and their executive bodies before and after 1956? And if so, to what degree? Or to highlight another aspect of this issue, how did political leadership establish the institutional system and legal framework required for the execution of systematic mass reprisals? And in what ways were the Kadarian reprisals parallel to the methods of the previous Stalinist period? I would only like to mention one brief example to highlight the significance of these questions. In the spring of 1957, following János Kádár's visit to Moscow, the reprisals intensified due to the establishment of these so-called regional people's court councils. These councils were authorized to review any non-appealable case, which allowed them to legally renegotiate any case that did not reach a satisfactory conclusion in the eyes of political leadership. However, the most cruel provision issued by the contemporary communist politicians at the time was the extension of the death penalty to anyone who was at least 16 years old. This section was used in the case of Peter Mansfeld, the youngest and most well-known victim of the legal reprisals. In other words, while these councils lasted, they made a useful contribution to Kádár's toolkit in the form of a court that only superficially resembled a real judicial council, while ensuring unlimited reprisal and the enforcement of the will of political leadership. Another factor of the reprisal that is also worth examining is what sort of cases did the reprisal focus on? I've already mentioned the major target groups of the reprisals, but right now I would like to highlight two lesser-known areas of research that are also affected international reception of Kádár regime. One of these questions related to the periodization of the reprisals. The end of the period is often linked to the year 1963, when János Kádár declared general amnesty, due to the fact that issuing general amnesty for political prisoners was one of the prerequisites for removing the Hungarian issue from the agenda of United Nations. Nevertheless, although the amnesty did lead to release of many victims of the reprisals, the majority of freedom fighters were detained, as the decree did not cover recidivists or freedom fighters who were declared ordinary criminals by the authorities, such as armed revolutionaries who were condemned on charges of murder. This means that while Kádár had considerable international success in declaring general amnesty, many participants of the events of 1956 were only released from prison in the 1970s. However, this is not the only reason behind the dilemma of the exact periodization of the reprisals. Further systematic research would be necessary to explore the lesser-known fact that in the Kádár regime, even after the general amnesty of 1963, some defendants were still being convicted on charges related to the revolution of '56. For instance, historical sources show that in 1966, on the 10th anniversary of the revolution, the political police initiated a large-scale program in the course of which they re-examined the documents of the reprisal of '56, which resulted in a new series of criminal trials related to the revolution. Based on the archival researches, cases have been come up that peasants who resisted the forced collectivization of agriculture were brought to court, and their activities during the events of 1956 were considered as an aggravating circumstance. All of this highlights the necessity of re-examining the little discussed phenomenon of political trials of 1960s and 70s in the happiest barracks of the social camp, as well as their potential connection to the events of 1956, which of course leads us right back to the issue of hidden continuity between the Rákosi and Kádár regime. Can we actually draw a sharp distinction between the early Kádarian system that carried out the reprisals and the consolidated Guláš communism of the late Kádár era? With regard to the reprisals following the events of 1956, at least, this is highly debatable. Regarding the reprisals, there is one more factor that must be added. How reliable are those documents which were made by the officers taking part in the reprisal? In other words, could we accurately reconstruct the events of 56 through contemporary judicial documentation, or would we only arrive at stories of 56 that were selectively recorded by the regime based on its own specific criteria and tailored to suit its own needs? In this respect, we should note that the needs were basically to demonstrate to the national and international public as convincingly as possible how the events of 1956 constituted a brutal counter-revolution against the current political system. At this point, I wish to conclude this talk by discussing the international reception of the Hungarian Revolution and its role in global politics. According to available documentation, the European status quo that emerged after World War II, along with the bipolar global order characterized by the opposition between the United States and the Soviet Union, basically sealed the fate of our region, including Hungary. To put it simply, the Hungarian Revolution of October 23rd was a surprise to Western governments and an unpleasant one at that. At the same time, in the context of the Cold War, international affairs were inseparable from ideological conflicts. Therefore, despite its limited significance in international politics, the Hungarian issue had a significant role in Western internal affairs and ideological debates about communism in general, which means that, paradoxically, the events of 56 mostly had international consequences for the West. In the era of mass media, news of the revolution and of the brutal intervention of the Soviet troops had a significant impact on public opinion and the assessment of Western communist parties. But, at the same time, Eastern communists also realized the impact of such propaganda. So by creating the counter-myth of 1956, presenting visual evidence of the brutality of the counter-revolution and justifying the ensuing political trials, they basically sought to compete with other political forces over the interpretation and reinterpretation and ideological utilization of the events of 1956. Nevertheless, from the perspective of 60 years, we can conclude that they only accomplished their goals partially and temporarily. In the end, 1956 was and remains a crucial symbol of the desire for freedom that characterized all East and Central European nations under the oppressive reign of the Soviet-time communist dictatorship. Thank you for your attention.